Hello, good morning. Welcome to this week's episode of Learn with Lorna, episode number 183, where we are looking at Diaries in the Fraser Tytler collection. What is not to love about every word in that title? My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland, in Inverness, Fort William, Portree and Wick. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland's a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events, a phrase that we had to put in after some scammers tried to get people to put their credit cards in way back at the beginning. So we still make that reference in there so that nobody ever ends up doing that. Donations, however, are very welcome. If you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for it. So this week is a return to my favourite collection, well, one of 3 favourite collections that I have. D766, The Papers of Fraser Tytler of Diaries. And, in a nice crossover, also one of my favourite record types, Diaries. There are multiple diaries in this collection. I've just been sitting here trying to work out if I can take out any of the examples I've chosen to make this fit into the half hour, because I've chosen so many entries. There are multiple diaries in this collection, as I said. About 63 individual diaries covering 200 years of this family's history and multiple individuals. So there's so many stories to go into, and I could have done, to be honest, an episode per diary or an episode per individual. So I may have to come back in the future and do subsequent episodes. But I have kept this episode really fairly unstructured. Just going to read some stories, really. Some extracts from these diaries. Some are about the Highlands, some are about journeys, travels, places further afield in the UK and then beyond the UK's shores. So lots and lots of information in them. So I'm going to start by looking at some of the earliest diaries in this collection, written by Alexander Fraser Tytler, Lord Wodehouse-Lee, and I think by his father, William Tytler. William Tytler was born in 1711. He was William Tytler of Wodehouse-Lee, which is down in Midlothian. He was married to Anne Craig, and he was a noted lawyer and historian, and you'll hear me say that a lot throughout this episode because those professions passed down through the generations. There's a diary within his son's papers, which I think is William Tytler's. It dates from 1731 to 34, and it details the journeys of a group. And it opens with the words, Journal of the Travels of A.R., T.R., W.R., T.B. and W.T. And that suggests to me that it's pretty logical that this would be William Tytler, given that it's in his son's papers and given that the dates are right. I have photographed and printed out huge extracts of this, but I'm going to just pick some and try and keep us within the time limit, or not too far off. So I'm going to start by looking at some of that group. Don't know who the other people are with those initials, but that group's trip around Scotland's central belt. So this one is from 1731. Monday, 16th of August 1731. Set out from Edinburgh a quarter of an hour before 6 in the morning, having breakfasted first heartily on tea, committed here a cruel blunder. So I wonder if we should not have eaten and drunk as much as we did before we set off. A quarter after 8, arrived at New Liston without any remarkable occurrence. Went through the gardens, tipped the gardener, and went to Hopetoun, one of the most extraordinary, beautiful, stately houses down in Central Belt. Much pleased with the house, he says. I saw most of the curiosities and then set out from there to Lithgow. Dined at Lithgow most heartily and went to call at Lucky Kenna's. There's just such interesting little references here. Walked from here to Falkirk and came there half an hour after 6, bespoke supper and tripped smartly to Arthur's Oven. Now, if there's anybody watching in the Falkirk, Central Belt, Fife kind of area, you may know about Arthur's Oven. I did not know about it, and I'm not going to go into it here, so do have an investigation if you want to know more about what Arthur's Oven is. He goes on to say that at twilight they went to Falkirk, where they met mine host, who, to make amends for his impertinence, he says, entertained us with a learned dissertation on witches and spectres seen by night by Arthur's Oven. He goes on to talk about how they travel more through the central belt. Sorry, forgive me turning pages, you can probably hear that. The different places that they visit and how they come to Glasgow. Wednesday morning, drank tea and marched for, I think it says Carncleuth, exceedingly pleased with the beautiful irregularities of the places, and passed away 3 hours in scrambling for wild berries and nuts, of which there were many besides apples, peaches and plums. From thence down the Clyde, which we swimmed over, and proceeded on the road for Glasgow. We arrived here about half an hour after 6. People are impertinent starers. There are all sorts of lovely sort of passing references in these. Talks then about the final places they visit. Not very impressed with Stirling, says there's very little to see in Stirling, which I think Stirling would disagree with. And then finishes at the end of this diary, we, having finished seeing these ruins in this particular place they're visiting, we then went on, had breakfast and at Cramond, and on the strength of this came to our journey's end. So just a lovely example of the sort of things that this group were doing. I don't know, as I say, who those other initials are, but in my head they're a group of young men who are out for a little bit of an adventure for a week or two. There's another entry, so I said that one was from 1731. There's a subsequent one from the following year, where again they talk about something very similar, going around, particularly around areas of Scotland, and what they see and experience. But I liked this extract from it. Wednesday, we rose about 8, drank tea and called for our bill, very cheap, and the house was very civil. Crossed the Tay and came to Scone. Saw the palace, the furniture was very pretty, but the keeper was a surly dotard. He goes on to talk about they're trying to get back, but it's late at night, and he says, we walked hard, moonlight for a little, but quite dark and off the road. What's to be done? We must have a guide. And then we fell in with a countryman going to by Kinross to Kelty. And with him we jogged on at a hard rate. We must certainly have lain in the hills if we had not seen him. So just some really interesting insights into the way people are travelling. There's a later diary I'll talk about in a second that talks about the concern about going into a city at night when they're not familiar with it. So the same thing there, that bit of concern about being out in the dark in an unknown area, whether that's just for being lost or whether that's for concern about what might happen. So speaking there about, I think those diaries will be William Tytler. As I say, they mention being written by W.T. and they're in his son's papers. So I'm relatively confident that that's who they are. But those are in the collection of William Tytler's son, Alexander, and that's who we're coming to next. Alexander Tytler, Lord Woodhouse-Lee, was born in Edinburgh in 1747. A historian and a biographer and a judge and a professor at Edinburgh University, so again those same professions. And Alexander Tytler married Anne Fraser in the 1770s, taking on through that marriage the estates of Balnain and Aldowrie. So that's where the Highland connection comes in. And also, it's that marriage that creates that joint name of Fraser Tytler, because Alexander Tytler takes on the Fraser name. And we hold several of Alexander's diaries from the 1770s and 1780s. And here are some entries from a diary entitled Journal of a Jaunt to London, April 1783, in which we find Alexander a bit more impressed by his surroundings than the previous diarist was by Stirling. Friday, breakfasted at Enfield Highway, came into London by Tottenham Green and landed at the Adelphi Hotel. Breakfasted with Kerr in Suffolk Street and went afterwards to be carried to the Record Office. Really lovely little tie-in for us, that's one of the things he wants to do while he's in London. 1780s, he wants to go to the Record Office. carried us to the record office where we saw Doomsday Book, very beautifully written. And also, I'm sure historians, of which I'm not one, but they would be very gratified to see him saying Doomsday Book and not the Doomsday Book. So apparently it is Doomsday Book. It was very beautifully written, he says. It is now printed for the use of the members of Parliament, but there is no index, which is a great want. It is, however, very methodically arranged under the heads of the different shires or counties, and the account of each begins with enumerating the lands which belong to the king, and then follows with a list of the great barons, and then a particular enumeration of every farm or spot of ground, the person to whom it belongs, and the tenants who occupy it, etc., etc. The room where the records are preserved is a very fine one. It is an octagon, formerly, I believe, the chapter house of Westminster Abbey, the roof supported by a single beautiful and slender pillar of stone. But the roof is faulty, though only lately repaired, and will probably not stand for long. So, as I say, just a really nice entry to see him talking about his excitement at seeing records. And there's so much detail in Alexander's diaries. He talks about London life in the 1780s. He talks about going to exhibitions, names pubs and hotels and inns that he visits. Entertainment. He names the famous coffee houses that he is visiting. He talks about going to Covent Garden, to Drury Lane, to see Sarah Siddon's famous actress, famous tragedy actress. He talks about going to masquerades, to balls and to Ranelagh pleasure gardens. So there's so much information we can gather about the names of businesses, about what's happening in the place at the time. He speaks about attending lectures given by the Antiquarian Society and by the Royal Society. The first that he goes to by the Antiquarian Society is on the discovery of a 700-year-old body preserved perfectly by the ground it has been buried in. And the second, given by the Royal Society, is about experiments being made in the attempt to freeze liquid. So just really interesting insights into what's being discussed at this sort of scientific forefront at the time. He talks about going to the Royal Academy to see their exhibition and gives his opinion on the paintings that he sees, the sculptures, the colouring abilities, modelling and all sorts of other things. And he didn't just stay in the city. He says here, walked out to Strawberry Hill, Horace Walpole's, I'll try that whole thing again. Walked on to Strawberry Hill, Horace Walpole's, built in the Gothic style, extremely beautiful. There's a profusion of painted glass in its windows, he says. It stands charmingly a little distance from the river. So from Strawberry Hill he goes on, which of course gave its entire name to Strawberry Hill Gothic, to a strand of design. Walked on to Hampton Court and arrived about 9 o'clock. Supped heartily, we get a lot of that, supping heartily. And then Monday the 12th of May, saw the palace, so Hampton Court Palace, before breakfast, some charming paintings in it, and the most magnificent apartments, particularly that suite of rooms that front onto the gardens. Took a chaise after breakfast for Windsor, past Staines, Runnymede, arrived at 12:30 at Windsor, saw the castle, noble indeed, charming paintings, St George's Chapel, very fine, although too low in the roof, he says. Strolled along the terrace for half an hour, the view is most delightful. Sauntered about the town until 3, and then took our places in the stage for London, 4 and 6 each, arrived in town at 7, 2 days delightfully spent. And the other thing that's striking about his diaries, although not really surprising given what I've seen in other collections, but it's quite striking, is just how many people he knows in London. So he's constantly referring to meeting people, and many of the landowners who had lands either in the Highlands or elsewhere in Scotland would also have had a base in London and would have been up and down the road, or along the coast more likely, very frequently. And so he refers to seeing Fraser of Lovett, bumping into Culdathel and other people in the city. So many of those come together to either go to the coffee house or to go to the debates that are taking place in the House of Commons or the House of Lords. And it's clear how very much at ease they are in both worlds. They operate in London and they operate on the estates at home as well. In this diary from 1773, Alexander is this time not visiting London, but is instead touring through south of Scotland and into England with his brother James. And it includes some really beautiful descriptive passages. It seems likely that he's setting out from that family house at Woodhouse Lee, because at this point he hasn't yet come into the Highland estates through that marriage. So he says here, again, a lovely turn of phrase. August the 24th, 1773. Having premeditated an expedition to Derbyshire this vacation, it was our care for some time past to make all the necessary preparations. We hired a very elegant whisky, which apparently was a little type of cart, so called because it could whisk around very quickly. Never heard that until I looked at this. We hired a very elegant whisky from Hume the coachmaker, which he got new painted and gilded for the occasion. Our greatest difficulty was to find a proper horse to draw our vehicle, and to the infamy of the police in the town of Edinburgh and the shame of the Society of Horsekeepers in particular, I must remark here in this my journal that there was in this whole city but one horse to be had, which would answer our purpose. This belonged to one Sutherland, who, upon the same principle with most of his paternity, determined to be no loser by an over-scrupulous conscience. He positively refused to yoke his horse under 4 shillings a day, and as there was no choice, we were forced to come under his terms. It's such a lovely, kind of snippy way of describing the fact that they paid more than they wanted to pay. So these brothers, Alexander and James, visited various places through the borders and then through England. He describes their time in Selkirk. He describes coming into Selkirk that it's pretty dismal until you come in sight of the Tweed, but says, we arrived at Selkirk around 1 o'clock. Mrs. Lang's is an excellent house. Our room is a most splendid one. There is one room where the county meetings are held, and I suppose likewise the Selkirk balls. Walked up before dinner to Haining, which is just at the end of the town of Selkirk. It is a fine place. Behind it is a little lake where there are a variety of fish, perch, pike, and a species called ged or gad, but what the nature of it is, I know not. While sitting in contemplation upon a tombstone in Selkirk churchyard, 2 of the town's young ladies chose to take a walk as if by accident among the tombs, and they passed and repassed us several times. We did not expect to find coquetry of so high a degree in the churchyard of Selkirk. He again continues, calling at the apothecary's shop, we learned that our friend Orator Curry is at present in town, which put us in a mortal fear that he would fasten upon us for a dinner. We therefore hastened with all speed to our own inn. I just love that feeling of, oh no, we know him, don't look. We'll all quickly get back, pretend we weren't out in the first place. But also, he says here, one thing is remarkable in Selkirk, which is the bread, which is the best I have ever eaten. Something that Selkirk will be delighted to hear, something they're still very proud of. So I'm mentioning there those great turns of phrase that he uses, and when he gets to Carlisle, he records them drinking punch in the evening, and then the next morning getting their beards polished and their curls frizzed up in a most barbarous manner. He goes through the Lake District with his brother, and as you would expect, it meets with his approval, and he writes in his diary, near to Penrith the prospect is most delightful. A tract of mountains are seen at a distance, which give an anticipated idea of the scenes which we found when passing through them. Penrith is a sweet village. After dinner we travelled towards Keswick through stupendous mountains. I never was more delighted than with this afternoon ride. All description is poor to paint these scenes. Imagination can but reach them. Lovely way of saying I have no sufficient words to describe this. He goes on to Ambleside and Grasmere, which he also appreciates, and what I found really fascinating when I was looking at this is Wordsworth and Coleridge and those poets and writers who would make Grasmere and Ambleside so famous at this point were about 2 or 3 years old. So they haven't yet done that writing that would bring those areas to so much fame. But Alexander could still see the potential for poets to be inspired. He says, "The views of Grasmere when we first come in sight of it from the top of the hill is the noblest scene that fancy can picture. The mountains seem yet higher and more abrupt than those of Keswick. The lake is much smaller, but the village, farmhouses, woods, torrents and cascades that strike the eye on every side are, even if possible, more beautiful here than those of Keswick. The most enthusiastic imagination of the most inspired poet could not suggest more noble scenes than what we are presented with in the whole course of this delightful ride from Keswick to Ambleside." We arrived at Ambleside at 9 o'clock with the favour of the moon. Just really beautifully descriptive writing, I think. Alexander and James went on to York, very impressed with the cathedral. They talk about Tadcaster and Leeds and all sorts of other places described in this diary. And we have a journal of James's, the brother, from around the same time, which is very similar in its feel. We're going to come on now to the next generation of the family. My old favourite, probably my favourite person who's been away from us for 200 years, William Fraser Tytler, Alexander's son. Again, a lawyer, a historian, an Edinburgh University professor and Sheriff of Inverness-shire. He was around from 1777 through to 1853. And we have many of William's daily diaries, and these record his expenditure, his travels, his appointments. So for years we can see what he was doing and where he was every single day because of his meticulous record keeping. I just find that extraordinary. So for instance, on Monday the 11th of July 1825, we know that he was in Bordeaux and he went shopping and he received payment for a bay horse. On Sunday the 24th, we know that on his way home he passed Ailsa Craig at noon and had 17 6 English money cash in hand. I just find that remarkable. In early September 1841, he was at Aldowrie, and he was there because the Inverness district registration was happening, part of the court calendar, and as the sheriff he would have been in attendance. And he noted on the 6th of September 1841, Barrett drowned. On the 7th he writes, registration court adjourned for Saturday to search for the body. And this was repeated in every day until Friday the 10th, when he says that the body was found in a pool and brought to Aldowrie. This is not a diary for emotion or description, but for small allocated spaces where he talks about what he's doing, what money he's spending, where he is, and so on. But never fear, because William's imagination and love of words find an escape elsewhere in his memorandum books, which are freehand written. And these absolutely delight me. Just any page you open in these books contain his kind of passion and outpouring, this voracious desire to learn and to discover things and to share them and to communicate them and to improve what he knows. So there's a page entitled Jamaica, which records the details about the country's population, the crops, its history, and so on. But then you turn the page and there are detailed lists of weights and measures. And then you turn the next page and he's written about horses, management, feeding, how to keep horses warm. Turn the next page and it's the monarchs of England listed by date. And then his thoughts on the proposed Caledonian Canal, which had not yet been built. And then you find detailed descriptions of every room in Aldowrie Castle with its measurements. Next page has the crop rotation in the Aldowrie fields. How to dike walls is on the following page. Which edition is the best of each classic book to buy? Drawings and diagrams and sketches, notes on the weather including a brilliant one entitled How to Forecast from Clouds. And amongst all of this, there are diary entries, things like this. 20th. Dined at William Arbuthnot's in the company of Walter Scott. Of course you did. A very instructive discussion on the Battle of Waterloo. This is 1818, so the Battle of Waterloo has only recently happened. A very instructive discussion on the Battle of Waterloo between Walter Scott and Sir Charles Colville, one of the heroes of the day. Both are very well acquainted with the ground, too much for their hearers, for many of their arguments and illustrations presupposed a knowledge which no one could possess who had not been on the spot. There are brilliant insights into William's personality in this diary. His frustration, he writes a whole section about how frustrated he is with people who use high-sounding words inappropriately to try and sound clever. He writes a brilliant story about a ludicrous story he had heard about a dog being told to, when the master leaves the room, he says to the dog, "Now look after your mistress while I'm out." And the dog sits right in front of her and won't let her leave. So every time she tries to get up the dog, he says, what's his wording? The dog, in a very respectful but determined manner, gave her to understand that he could not permit her to rise from her seat, and although she repeatedly attempted, she was actually kept a prisoner until the master returned. And he takes great pleasure in this story. He finds it really funny. We're definitely going to roll over time-wise, and I'm sorry, I will do my best to be as quick as possible. But you can see that I love this collection. It's William's son we're going to come on to next, his youngest son, General Sir James MacLeod Bannatyne Fraser Tytler, born 1821. And he was, along with his brother, a noted military leader. He served in Afghanistan and India with great distinction. He had multiple medals, honours, decorations, until he died at the age of 93 in 1914. And this diary entry dates from 1838, when James was just 17. Really interesting to check the age. It will make you rethink what you've read when you go, oh my word, you were that age when you wrote that. Now, I wasn't as familiar with James Bannatyne Fraser Tytler, so I photographed his entire diary and sat in bed with a cup of tea and read the whole thing. And here are just a couple of extracts. Started after breakfast and drove along a beautiful but precipitous road past Urquhart Castle and the banks of Loch Ness to Glenmorison's place in Vermorrison, where I was most kindly received. Thank you, Anne, for the permission to run over. I'm grateful. I am conscious when I do it. But for someone whose life would end up being so international, and James MacLeod Bannatyne Fraser Tytler spent most of his time, as I say, in India and different places. But a lot of this diary deals with local people and places. He talks about visiting Bewley and Loch Ness, Skye, Loch Aber. He says Highlanders are exceedingly inquisitive, not from impudence, but from a want of knowing that their questions are impertinent. I liked this extract. Quite, again, if you think that he's 17 at the time he's written this. He says, capital inn and excellent dinner. My uncle's birthday today, being his 61st year, we drank his health, and my mother's, which I forgot on the 3rd. God bless and keep her. There is something solemn in drinking the healths of our absent friends, and none were forgotten tonight. Oh, how differently did I a few short months ago think of our absent ones in India, when he who was dearest of all to me was to be remembered among them. Last night I was dreaming and restless, and I had a distinct dream of my brother, but not, as often has been the case, a painful one. It was quite the contrary, and I could not trace it to any particular train of thought or action during the day, as I often have done. And I think that reference there will be to George Fraser Tytler, his brother, who had died just 2 years before he wrote this diary at the age of 29, although he also lost his brother Alexander before that, also at the age of 29. He talks fondly about Uncle P, who I think is Peter Grant Peterkin, who I spoke about in connection with the Highlands connection to the Caribbean. He talks a lot about Uncle P's fondness for sport, but also he was very keen James was very keen on the outdoors and being outside in nature as well, because he says here, magnificent morning, woke at 7, breakfasted not until 10, books being rather deficient in the drawing room, I went to the hill at about 11, killed 7 brace and a hare, quite in love with my little gun for its long throwing, lovely view of 5 counties, I believe all the plain of Murray stretched out like a painting below me, and the bold headlands of Ross standing relieved from the sea, and the higher Ross hills sharply drawn against a rich sky, proved a most lovely scene, while the day itself was not too hot, and altogether my temper was extremely composed and placid. Just a lovely way of writing about how you feel. There's a real gentleness to some of James's diary entries. He loses his dog, Cato, and he goes searching and searching, goes into Inverness to ask the town crier to help see if he can find Cato. And on a later date, he finds another lost dog, and he takes care of it until its owner can be traced, because he says how much he would have appreciated it if someone had done the same for Cato. When someone else gets married, he makes a passing reference to their marriage and ponders about if he will get married or how his life will turn out. The next generation we're coming to, and I've just got a couple of people left to touch on, so it shouldn't be too long. Next generation we're coming to is James's nephew, Edward Grant Fraser Tytler, who was 1856 to 1918, and also his wife, Edith Selwyn. And Edward, again, was a noted military leader. He was heavily involved in the Lovat Scouts, and we hold his diaries for trips to India, to Egypt, and other places. But I'm going to focus on his 1874 diary, in which he goes from Britain to Portugal, and then past the coast of Africa and on to South America, referencing Montevideo in Uruguay, Monte Grande in Argentina, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, Buenos Aires, and various other places. 1874. There are a few bits of this diary that made me laugh out loud. He describes getting on the ship, setting off, and meeting a woman immediately. Immediately on getting on the ship, he meets a woman so awful that he hopes she will be sick for the entire journey so that he doesn't have to see her again. He notes that the ship has a piano, but as they have lost the key and no one can play it anyway, it's not very useful. There's a huge amount of information in this diary about the landscape, about visiting gaucho ranches, lizards, the horses that South America were so famous for using, sport, palm trees and landscape and so on. But I wanted to share one particular story which is much more sobering. Right, this is one I've printed out. We had a terrible night last night. I was sound asleep about 3 o'clock when I was suddenly awoken by the engine stopping and people running over and crying. I heard cries for help coming from the water, and I of course thought there was a man overboard. Papa said he had felt a slight shock on the ship too, and we both jumped out of our bunks like lightning. I pulled on my trousers and rushed up on deck. There was a sailor there, and I asked him if there was a man overboard, and he said, "A whole crew, sir. We have run down a small schooner." I heard cries for help. They seemed quite close at first. It was awful. There we were, sailing away, and the poor wretches were screaming for help. All the sails were set, and we were going at the rate of 12.5 knots. The captain was in his nightgown, and he ordered the engines to be reversed for us to be able to turn, and the helm set hard a starboard, which brought us round and back towards the ship. I ran downstairs to get my boots and my coat on. All the women were gathered together, screaming, firmly believing that the ship was going down. "Here, John, you can swim, you take the baby, I'll go down with the ship," etc., etc. When I came on deck, they were getting the boat ready. The third mate and 4 men jumped in. It was a very dark night. All the sails were flapping wildly about, and nobody could see, and nobody could be spared. Some of us jumped to help the crew to swing the boat over. They called for lifebuoys for the boat. I ran aft, and there were none, so I ran to the bridge, and there were none there either. They had all been thrown to the drowning crew. At last, a sailor got some of the lifeboats out. I got them a fire bucket in case the boat was in water and they needed to bail out. He says we burned blue lights, and at one time the boat went out of sight. We fired a rocket which was answered by a blue light. The poor men had ceased shouting for some time. The shouting had stopped for some time after us, and our searching was over an hour, and eventually the boat came back, so the small lifeboat came back to the ship. The sea here was swarming with sharks, and there was very little chance for those men. We hoisted the boat, and we steamed away. The steamer had cut her right in two, and her bows went past the port side, and her stern went past the starboard side. Most of the poor fellows must have been in their bed, and never able to get out. They had no light burning, and that was why the ship had hit them. And he says our ship received only a slight scratch on the bow. But what I found really striking there, and I didn't read the first sentence that he says there, was, "This is my birthday today. I am 18 years old." I mentioned that we also hold diaries for Edward's wife, Edith, and again we have many of these, both tiny, tiny engagement books and more detailed diaries. And some of them are very light-hearted, short entries that shed light on basically being a lady in an upper class society. So for instance, on the 23rd of July 1879, garden party and dance, 250 present, stayed up till 1 p.m. dancing, a splendid fine day. Or the 8th of May, went to court, the Queen was there. But some of them are very tightly packed, dense pages of writing, detailing social events, skating parties, ice hockey, who knew, church services, the weather. But I always find journeys really interesting, and Edith talks about taking trains, going by carriage, going to Stevenage and Stoke and Bletchley, finally going on a shopping trip where she can replace her hideous carpets, she says. So like I say, very much an insight into the social life of her life, and later of Ted, as she calls Edward. But it's very clear that Edith's life wasn't all kind of skittles and whatever that phrase is, skittles and beer. There are frequent references to neuralgia, to palpitations, to being exhausted. And in 1883, Edward and Edith had a son called Charles Edward Fraser Tytler. And he died on the 7th of October, 1885, at 3 years old. And a look at Edith's diary from the following year shows the impact that this has had on her. She writes about visiting her Sonny's Cross. There's a picture of it inside the diary. She says, "Today would have been my darling's 4th birthday, a very sad day for me now, when this day last year was so happy." Sometimes she says the memory of what happened has become too much for me and is overwhelming. But she did have another child at this time, and she talks frequently about her daughter, Hester, and she would go on to have another son, Neil. And we have multiple diaries for both Hester and Neil, and it's Hester that I want to finish with. We have diaries of Hester's from 1898 through to 1938, taking us to 200 years of diaries from this family. And if we look at the earliest volume, 1898, Hester was only 12, which I hadn't realised until I again did that calculation. And there are entries that indicate her age, so things like on the 3rd of March, first dancing lesson, I like it awfully. Or the opening page, got this book on January the 12th, 1898, and hope I won't spill my soup over it as I did with my last. In 1908, Hester married Alan Cameron, the son of Cameron of Lochiel. And it appears from both of their diaries that this was an incredibly happy marriage. Hester often refers to him as my beloved, and they started a family with baby Angus being baptised in 1914. But I knew that Alan had gone off to fight very early in the First World War. He was among the first British troops going out to France with the British Expeditionary Force. And so I turned to Hester's diaries for that year, and I found that their glorious summer activities give way to Hester sewing Alan's uniform, him leaving for Aldershot and then Southampton, and her brother Neil also went. And she clings to his letters, and she records in her diary every time she gets a letter from him. And on the 3rd of September 1914 she writes, "I'm feeling funny. I hope it's me and not Alan." And who knows whether it was her or Alan, because 3 weeks later Alan was killed. Only 7 weeks after Britain entered the war, Alan was killed. And Hester's diary says, "My beloved gave his life today." And what I find even more unbearable than that entry are the entries on subsequent days where she continues to receive letters that he had sent before dying. She receives a postcard from him on the same day that she receives the call from the War Office, and she says, "I just went to sit on the hill." Then it's the pressure of the news becoming made public and receiving telegrams and sympathy. She gets a telegram from the King and Queen, and she writes in her diary, "This is all a nightmare." And on the 5th of October, she writes, "Got a letter from my darling dated the 23rd. He had just got my socks. I am so thankful." And this, she also says, this was his last letter and the last day he wrote in his diary. And the following day, she writes, "This is my wedding day anniversary. Heard that they had buried him in the churchyard at Bourg." And the final thing I wanted to share from Hester's diary, and I'm so sorry I've gone from a real high and some funny stories to finish on this note, but this is the reality of people's lives, as we all know. The final thing I want to share is an entry from Hester's diary, a piece of writing on the inside of a back cover, so it's not even under any date. And she's written, "This is written with my darling stylo, October the 31st, 1915, with the ink that he put in it." And I just found that so touching, because who of us hasn't done that, trying to cling on to the last thing? So diaries can give us so much, and Jen, as you say, there is a risk that there are going to be gaps in the future. But it's fantastic to have 200 years of diaries for this one family. Fascinating, wonderfully interesting family. You can see why it's a favourite collection of mine and why I could have done multiple episodes. But I'm going to let you go. Hope you can join me next week for Stories from Cromarty, which seems to have excited a whole lot of discussion and chat from across the world. So I hope you're looking forward to Stories from Cromarty. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series. If you're able to donate towards our work to help us continue to look after these extraordinary records and share them with people, then please do donate towards our work. Thank you.